World Order by Henry Kissinger. Introduction. The question of world order. In the introduction of World Order, Henry Kissinger sets the intellectual and philosophical foundation for the book by confronting a fundamental question that has shaped centuries of global politics. What is world order, and how can it be established and preserved? He does not assume a singular or universal definition, nor does he treat it as a fixed structure. Instead, he explores it as a dynamic, evolving concept, one that has emerged differently in various civilizations and moments in history, shaped by deeply rooted cultural, religious, and political traditions. For Kissinger, world order is not simply the absence of war or conflict, nor is it merely a set of formal treaties and legal frameworks. It is a condition in which the various actors in the international system accept and adhere to a set of commonly accepted rules and principles, allowing for a level of predictability, stability, and peaceful interaction. But history, as he quickly points out, offers little reassurance that such a consensus is ever permanent or easily achieved. Kissinger begins by highlighting the precariousness of modern international affairs. Despite the vast interconnectedness that globalization has ushered in, there remains a growing divergence among the world's major powers on the nature of a legitimate international order. What the West considers a rules-based global structure, rooted in sovereignty, legal equality, and non-intervention, is not universally shared. Russia, China, the Islamic world, and even some Western powers harbor fundamentally different assumptions about power, legitimacy, and justice. These differences are not minor or procedural. They are rooted in contrasting worldviews, shaped by centuries of history and experience, and they often produce conflicting strategies for how order should be organized and maintained. To frame this issue, Kissinger invokes the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War in Europe. He views this as the first attempt to construct a modern international order based on sovereign states, with each having the right to control its domestic affairs without outside interference. This Westphalian system, though born in Europe, has since been exported globally, especially after the colonial era and the two world wars. Its core principles, sovereignty, non-intervention, and legal equality, underpin the modern United Nations system and much of today's diplomatic norms. However, Kissinger is quick to note that this system is not a universal moral truth, but a historical product of European conflict and compromise. Other civilizations developed alternative ideas about governance and order, some of which have resurfaced in today's global tensions. For instance, Kissinger contrasts the Westphalian tradition with the Chinese concept of order, which historically emphasized harmony under a hierarchical structure, with China at the center of civilization. Unlike the West, which fragmented into competing states, China developed a centralized empire, where internal order and external tribute defined relations. Similarly, in the Islamic world, the concept of a unified religious political order under the Caliphate dominated historical thought, with less emphasis on national borders or the sovereignty of separate states. In the American context, Kissinger observes a strong moralistic streak in foreign policy thinking, a tendency to view international relations through the lens of good versus evil, liberty versus tyranny. This approach often leads to a missionary style of diplomacy, where the U.S. seeks not only to secure its interests but to remake the world in its own image. Kissinger does not critique any one system as inherently superior. Rather, he underscores the challenge that arises when these distinct conceptions of order collide on the global stage. In today's world, multiple powers with different visions of legitimacy and justice coexist and compete, yet no comprehensive consensus has emerged to mediate their differences. In such a situation, how can the world maintain peace and cooperation? This is the central dilemma of our time, according to Kissinger. And it is not a new one that he draws upon historical examples to show how past societies tried to create order amid chaos. After the Napoleonic Wars, for example, the Congress of Vienna in 1815 sought to restore balance by creating a concert of great powers that would consult and act collectively to preserve peace. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States led efforts to build a liberal international order based on democracy, economic interdependence, and institutions like the United Nations and the World Bank. These efforts had some success. especially during the Cold War, when the bipolar competition between the US and the Soviet Union paradoxically brought a measure of stability. But with the Cold War's end and the subsequent unipolar moment in which American power dominated, the question of global order became more complicated. Kissinger argues that the post-Cold War world has lacked a clear sense of direction. The fall of the Soviet Union did not usher in an era of harmony, but rather exposed deep fractures. The United States, enjoying unmatched power, often acted unilaterally, believing that its values and institutions would inevitably spread. However, this assumption proved naive. The rise of China, the resurgence of Russian nationalism, the fragmentation of the Middle East, and the spread of radical ideologies all challenged the universality of the Western model. Moreover, the rapid pace of technological change, economic globalization, and mass communication added new layers of complexity. In such a volatile environment, the traditional mechanisms of diplomacy and statecraft are often overwhelmed by immediacy, emotion, and unpredictability. Throughout the introduction, Kissinger warns against simplistic notions of peace through enforcement or domination. Lasting order, he argues, cannot be imposed by force alone. It requires a shared sense of legitimacy. This legitimacy, in turn, must be rooted in a careful balance between power and principle. If order rests solely on power, it becomes unstable and prone to rebellion. If it is based only on moral ideals without regard for realities of power, it risks collapse or irrelevance. The art of diplomacy lies in harmonizing these two forces, respecting the cultural and political realities of different societies while seeking common ground for cooperation. He also emphasizes that disorder is the default condition of international life. The emergence of order is a historical exception, achieved only through immense effort, tragedy, and compromise. The Peace of Westphalia, for example, was preceded by decades of bloodshed and religious conflict. The post-World War II order required unprecedented destruction to bring leaders to the table. These historical experiences suggest that order does not arise naturally from good intentions or common humanity. It must be constructed, maintained, and periodically reformed. This construction requires visionaries who can look beyond narrow interests and recognize the long-term needs of peace and stability. Kissinger calls for a new, thoughtful approach to diplomacy, one that is aware of history but not trapped by it. He believes that the 21st century needs a global order that reflects the diversity of civilizations while preserving the possibility of peaceful coexistence. This is no easy task. It requires leaders to combine moral clarity with strategic patience. It demands a willingness to engage with rivals, understand their worldviews, and seek accommodations that do not betray core values. It also means building institutions that can adapt to rapid change and uncertainty, especially in the face of transnational threats like terrorism, climate change, cyberwarfare, and pandemics. The introduction closes with a cautious but urgent tone. Kissinger sees the world as being at a crossroads. Without a coherent vision of order, international affairs may drift into a new era of confrontation, fragmentation, and perhaps catastrophic conflict. But he also believes that the tools of diplomacy, statecraft, and historical awareness still offer a path forward. His book, therefore, is an attempt to explore how different civilizations have understood the concept of order, how past leaders have responded to crises, and how today's world might craft a new equilibrium that balances diversity with unity. This opening section is not just a preface. It is a call to serious reflection. Kissinger does not provide easy answers or idealistic solutions. Instead, he invites readers into a deeper exploration of the forces that have shaped the international system and the responsibilities that come with power. The question of world order, he suggests, is not just a matter for policymakers or scholars. It concerns all of humanity, for in an interconnected world, the collapse of order anywhere can ripple across borders and oceans. If we are to navigate the uncertainties of our time, we must begin with a clear-eyed understanding of how order has been imagined, contested, and sometimes achieved throughout history. Kissinger's introduction sets the stage for this journey, weaving together insight, caution, and a profound awareness of the stakes involved. Part 1. Europe and Westphalia. Europe. The pluralistic international order, the European balance of power system, and its breakdown, the United States and Iran. Approaches to order. In Part 1 of World Order, Henry Kissinger lays the foundational understanding of how the modern idea of international order came into being, focusing on the European experience. He traces how the continent, once racked by near-constant religious warfare, gradually evolved a model that balanced the ambitions of individual states with an overarching structure that preserved a modicum of peace. This section begins by examining the Peace of Westphalia, a momentous event in European history that introduced the concept of state sovereignty and set the tone for a more structured and rational international order. Kissinger sees this model, born out of Europe's specific historical context, as both a unique achievement and a concept that has struggled to take root outside the West. Before Westphalia, Europe was a continent defined by religious authority, especially that of the Catholic Church, and by empires that claimed to rule by divine right. Political legitimacy often derived from religious unity, and rulers fought to assert that their vision of divine truth should dominate. This led to decades of brutal conflict, most notably the 30 Years' War, which devastated large parts of the continent. It was in the wake of this carnage that the Peace of Westphalia was signed in 1648. Kissinger views this treaty not merely as a peace agreement, but as a philosophical turning point. It articulated for the first time the idea that each state had the right to govern itself without outside interference, a principle now known as sovereignty. This sovereignty-based order was revolutionary because it allowed for the peaceful coexistence of states with vastly different systems of governance and belief. Rather than trying to enforce a single correct religion or ideology across borders, European powers began to accept the notion that other states could follow their own paths without necessarily threatening the international system. It was a system built on balance rather than consensus, on mutual tolerance rather than shared values. The guiding idea was not that all states were friends, but that no one state should be so powerful as to dominate the rest. Diplomacy, in this context, became a critical tool, not just for resolving disputes, but for preserving equilibrium. Kissinger notes that this system of order was deeply pragmatic. It was less about moral truths than about political necessity. The horrors of religious war had taught leaders that some kind of workable system was preferable to the chaos of unrestrained conflict. Over time, this balance of power model allowed Europe to flourish politically and economically, even amid persistent rivalries and wars. The system had flexibility and resilience. It accommodated the rise and fall of powers and managed, for long periods, to prevent continent-wide conflicts. However, it was also inherently unstable because it depended on the constant recalibration of power and required wise leadership, skilled diplomacy, and a shared commitment to the rules. Yet this European order was far from perfect. It was exclusionary, primarily a club of European states. Non-European nations were either ignored or subjugated. The European model, while successful on its own terms, never fully addressed how to integrate other civilizations or reconcile fundamentally different worldviews. Kissinger underscores that the Westphalian order was accepted not because of universal philosophical agreement, but because it worked. It prevented chaos. Still, as Europe expanded its influence across the world through colonialism, it exported its state-centric system to regions with entirely different traditions of governance and order. This transplantation was often forced and incomplete, leading to long-term instability in places like the Middle East and parts of Asia and Africa that in the second chapter, Kissinger dives deeper into how the balance of power system functioned and eventually unraveled. In the centuries following Westphalia, European politics became a game of strategic alliances, military deterrence, and calculated diplomacy. The system didn't eliminate war, but it made war less apocalyptic. Conflicts were limited in scope and duration because the powers were wary of any state becoming too strong. Nations like Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, and later Germany and Russia all vied for influence, but their actions were tempered by the understanding that too much aggression could trigger a coalition against them. This was the unwritten rule of the balance of power modeled. The center of this system was the belief that peace could be preserved through equilibrium. If one country became too powerful, others would join forces to check its rise. Kissinger sees this as a kind of self-regulating mechanism. States did not need to agree on values or political systems. They simply needed to recognize their shared interest in avoiding dominance by any single actor. The Congress of Vienna in 1815, following the Napoleonic Wars, was one of the high points of this model. European leaders redrew the continent's borders and established norms for diplomacy that preserved peace for much of the 19th century. They recognized that lasting stability required cooperation, even among rivals. However, this system began to falter with the rise of nationalism and ideology. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the idea of the nation-state gained emotional and political power. People began to define themselves less in terms of dynasties and more in terms of shared language, culture, and destiny. This gave rise to mass politics and increased public pressure on governments to act boldly in defense of national pride. Diplomacy became more difficult as leaders faced domestic pressures that often pushed them toward confrontation rather than compromise. Kissinger argues that the balance of power system was further undermined by the emergence of ideologies that rejected its core premise. Communism and fascism, for instance, did not seek coexistence. They sought dominance. They aimed to remake the world according to their own blueprints and saw diplomacy not as a tool for managing differences, but as a means to expand power. The outbreak of World War I shattered the old European order. It revealed the fragility of a system that, while elegant in theory, could not withstand the pressures of nationalism, arms races, and rigid alliances. The peace settlements that followed the war, particularly the Treaty of Versailles, failed to restore balance. Instead, they sowed the seeds of further conflict. The interwar years were marked by a vacuum of leadership and a lack of consensus on how to rebuild order. The League of Nations, created to prevent future wars, lacked enforcement power and failed to check the rise of aggressive states like Nazi Germany. World War II was even more devastating than the first and marked the complete breakdown of the European system. After 1945, the balance of power was no longer centered in Europe, but in the global rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War introduced a new form of bipolar order, stable in some ways, but built on the threat of mutual destruction. Europe, divided and weakened, became the battleground for ideological and strategic competition between two superpowers. In the final chapter of Part 1, Kissinger shifts his focus from Europe to a comparative analysis of two very different approaches to world order, those of the United States and Iran. He uses these two countries as case studies to illustrate the challenges of reconciling deeply different worldviews within a single international system. The United States, according to Kissinger, has always viewed its foreign policy through a moralistic lens. Rooted in the ideals of the Enlightenment and the American Revolution, the U.S. sees itself not just as a nation-state, but as a symbol of universal values, freedom, democracy, and human rights. Its leaders often believe that spreading these values will lead to peace and stability, and that American power is inherently benevolent because it serves a moral purpose. This vision of order is less about balance and more about transformation. The U.S. tends to support international institutions and norms, but always with the expectation that they should reflect American ideals. This has sometimes led to tension when other nations do not share the same vision or resent American dominance. Kissinger notes that while the U.S. has had moments of realism and pragmatism in its foreign policy, its default posture often involves trying to remake the world in its own image. This has worked in some cases, but has also led to overreach and miscalculation, especially when ideals outstrip strategic considerations. In contrast, Iran represents a radically different conception of order, one that fuses religion and statecraft. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran has positioned itself as both a nation-state and a revolutionary movement. It does not simply seek security within the existing international order. It aims to reshape that order according to its religious and ideological principles. Iranian leaders often view the world through a lens of resistance and confrontation, particularly against the West. They see their role as protectors of Sharia Islam and challengers of a global system they believe is unjust and corrupt. Kissinger highlights how Iran's approach is rooted in a very different history and worldview. Unlike the US, which was born out of secular Enlightenment ideals, Iran's political identity is deeply tied to religious authority and a sense of historical grievance. The country's leaders often frame foreign policy in terms of divine mission and moral struggle, rather than pragmatic calculation. This makes traditional diplomacy with Iran particularly difficult, as compromise is often viewed as betrayal rather than a necessary part of international relations. What makes the US-Iran contrast so significant, according to Kissinger, is that both nations are exceptionalist in their own ways. Each believes it has a unique mission to shape the world. But their visions are incompatible. One is secular and liberal, the other religious and revolutionary. This creates a structural challenge for any stable world order. If key players in the system do not agree on the basic rules or purposes of that system, then diplomacy becomes less about finding common ground and more about managing confrontation. Kissinger's analysis of these two nations serves as a warning. The Westphalian system, with its emphasis on sovereignty and balance, was designed to manage diversity without requiring ideological consensus. But in a world where major powers have deeply divergent visions of legitimacy and order, the system's limits are exposed. The challenge for the 21st century, as he sees it, is to find a way to reconcile these competing visions without descending into chaos or endless conflict. The European experience offers some lessons, but it cannot be applied wholesale to a world of rising powers, historical grievances, and ideological fervor. In sum, Part 1 of World Order outlines the rise and limits of the European system of international relations. It tells the story of how a continent once torn apart by religious war managed to create a framework for peaceful coexistence, only to see that framework eroded by nationalism, ideology, and global conflict. Kissinger uses this history to frame the broader question of whether a truly global order can ever be built, one that respects different cultures and beliefs while still maintaining peace and stability. His comparison of the United States and Iran illustrates the profound difficulties involved in achieving this goal. While the Westphalian model was a landmark achievement, it was born of Europe's unique history and may not be sufficient to meet the challenges of today's multipolar and ideologically fragmented world. Part 2. The Islamic world and Asia. The multiplicity of the Asian orders toward a Pacific community acting for all mankind. The United States and its concept of order. In Part 2 of World Order, Henry Kissinger turns his attention to the intricate and often contradictory regional orders of the Islamic world and Asia, and how these areas have developed their own unique approaches to power, legitimacy, and international relations. This section highlights the complexity of integrating these regional orders into a coherent global framework. Kissinger does not treat the Islamic world or Asia as monoliths, but rather as a mosaic of civilizations and political systems shaped by distinct historical, philosophical, and religious traditions. He explores how these traditions have influenced the regional balance of power and shaped interactions with Western powers, especially the United States, and how they will continue to shape world order in the 21st century. Kissinger begins with a deep dive into the Islamic world, not merely as a region, but as a civilization with a distinct worldview. Unlike the Westphalian model that emerged in Europe, founded on the notion of sovereign states coexisting under a balance of power system, the Islamic political tradition was historically rooted in the concept of a universal religious community under a single, divinely sanctioned leader, the Caliph. This idea rejected the legitimacy of nation-states as defined by territorial boundaries. Instead, it proposed a unified ummah, or community of believers, guided by Sharia law and spiritual authority. The collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate after World War I left a void that has never been fully resolved. In its place emerged a fragmented Middle East, divided by colonial mandates and artificial borders, resulting in unstable states that often lack cohesive national identities. This historical context, Kissinger argues, helps explain the deep instability and persistent conflict in the region. The rise of radical Islamism is not merely a reaction to Western policies, but also a product of this unresolved tension between universalist religious aspirations and the modern state system. Groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS reject the legitimacy of the post-colonial state system altogether, seeking instead to revive a form of the caliphate that erases national boundaries and enforces a singular ideological and religious order. In this view, diplomacy and peaceful coexistence with non-Islamic powers is heretical or at least a tactical necessity rather than a genuine goal. Kissinger suggests that Western policymakers often fail to grasp the depth of this ideological challenge. They approach the region with strategies designed for state actors operating within a shared framework of legitimacy, not movements motivated by transcendent religious visions that see violence as a form of purification. This makes conventional diplomacy almost impossible because there is no common ground on which to negotiate. Kissinger emphasizes that lasting stability in the Islamic world will not come from external imposition, but from within. When its societies reconcile their spiritual and political traditions with the demands of modern governance and international norms, from there, the discussion shifts eastward to Asia, where the challenge is not religious ideology, but the sheer multiplicity of regional orders, each shaped by its own historical narrative and strategic imperatives. Unlike Europe, where a common cultural and religious heritage allowed for a relatively coherent international system, Asia is characterized by cultural diversity, uneven power distribution, and long-standing rivalries. The region's geography, mountain, ranges, seas, and peninsulas, has encouraged the development of discrete civilizations such as China, India, Japan, and Southeast Asia, each with its own sense of exceptionalism and historical destiny. China occupies a central place in this discussion. Kissinger delves into the traditional Chinese worldview, centered around the idea of the Middle Kingdom as the apex of a hierarchical international system. Historically, China saw itself as a self-sufficient civilization to which other nations paid tribute, not as one state among many in a competitive international system. This Sinocentric order was not based on balance of power politics, but on cultural superiority and moral virtue. The arrival of Western powers in the 19th century, armed with superior military technology and an entirely different conception of international relations, shattered this worldview and plunged China into what it calls the century of humiliation. Modern China, according to Kissinger, is still grappling with the legacy of that experience. It has embraced elements of the Westphalian system by becoming a sovereign state and joining institutions like the United Nations. However, its long-term strategic culture remains informed by historical patterns of central authority, territorial integrity, and civilizational pride. The Chinese Communist Party, while officially atheist, draws heavily on Confucian concepts of order, hierarchy, and harmony to justify its authority and project influence. Kissinger argues that China's rise will test the adaptability of the current world order, especially if it seeks to reshape international norms to reflect its own values rather than merely integrate into the existing system. India presents a different case. While it too is a civilization state with a long historical memory, its modern identity has been shaped by colonialism and democracy. Kissinger notes that India's strategic culture is more reactive and defensive compared to China's proactive statecraft. This is partly due to its fragmented geography, diverse population, and democratic system, which makes bold foreign policy moves politically difficult. India's foreign policy has often sought autonomy rather than alignment, balancing relationships with major powers without fully committing to any camp. Its challenge lies in managing internal diversity and external threats, especially from neighboring Pakistan and China, while pursuing economic growth and regional influence. Japan, on the other hand, offers a unique example of a non-Western society that fully embraced modernity without sacrificing its cultural identity. Following its defeat in World War II, Japan adopted a pacifist constitution and became a key ally of the United States. However, Kissinger points out that Japan's strategic position is becoming more precarious as China rises and the American security guarantee appears less absolute than in previous decades. Japan faces a dilemma: how to maintain its peaceful identity while ensuring its national security in a rapidly changing regional environment. Kissinger also examines Southeast Asia, a region marked by diversity, colonial legacies, and the constant balancing of external influences. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, has provided a framework for regional cooperation, but it lacks the institutional strength and unity of purpose to act as a true strategic bloc. Countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines must navigate between major powers, particularly China and the United States, while maintaining their autonomy and managing internal challenges. This multiplicity of orders, with no single hegemon and no unified philosophy of governance, makes Asia both a dynamic and volatile part of the world that in the next chapter, Kissinger explores the idea of a Pacific community, a term that evokes a shared identity among the countries bordering the Pacific Ocean, particularly the United States and the major Asian powers. He asks whether such a community can be built on mutual respect, common interests, and shared rules, or whether the region is destined to become the arena of great power rivalry. The United States has long seen itself as a Pacific power with deep economic, military, and historical ties to the region. However, its engagement has often been episodic and reactive, driven by crises rather than a coherent long-term vision. Kissinger argues that a genuine Pacific community would require reconciling different visions of order. The American model emphasizes individual freedom, open markets, and democratic institutions, while China and other Asian powers may favor stability, sovereignty, and gradual reform. These are not necessarily incompatible, but they require a level of trust and compromise that has so far been elusive. The United States must decide whether it wants to shape the Pacific order through dominance or partnership. If it chooses the former, it risks provoking resistance and instability. If it chooses the latter, it must be prepared to accommodate alternative perspectives and accept limits to its influence that a successful Pacific community, in Kissinger's view, would not be a uniform bloc, but a flexible framework that allows for coexistence among different systems. It would emphasize transparency, dispute resolution, and mutual respect rather than ideological conformity. Such a structure would not eliminate competition, but it could channel it into peaceful and constructive forms. The key is not to impose a singular order, but to manage diversity within a rules-based system. This requires diplomatic skill, strategic patience, and a willingness to learn from history. The final chapter of Part 2 turns the focus back to the United States, exploring its unique conception of order and how it has shaped global politics. Unlike European powers that emerged from a balance of power tradition, the United States was born out of a revolutionary ideology that saw itself as a moral beacon for the world. From its founding, America believed it had a special mission to promote liberty, democracy, and justice. This exceptionalism has been a source of strength and inspiration, but also of inconsistency and overreach. Kissinger notes that American foreign policy has oscillated between realism and idealism. At times, it has pursued pragmatic strategies based on national interest. At other times, it has launched crusades for democracy and human rights. This duality can be confusing for allies and adversaries alike. For example, the United States has supported authoritarian regimes when it served its strategic interests, while also championing democratic revolutions when the opportunity arose. This has led to accusations of hypocrisy and inconsistency. Even as American power has remained a central pillar of world order, the American approach to diplomacy, rooted in Enlightenment ideals, assumes that other nations can be persuaded to adopt similar values through reason, trade, and institutions. However, as Kissinger points out, many parts of the world operate according to different logics. In societies where history, identity, and survival are paramount, appeals to abstract principles may fall flat or even backfire. The challenge for the United States is to uphold its values without becoming blind to the realities of power, culture, and context. Kissinger also explores how America's global role is evolving in the 21st century. With the relative decline of its unipolar dominance, the U.S. must navigate a more multipolar world where other powers, especially China, assert their own visions of order. This transition requires a more nuanced and flexible diplomacy, one that acknowledges the limits of American power while still defending the core principles of the liberal order. It must also involve a rethinking of alliances, institutions, and strategic priorities. Ultimately, Kissinger argues that the United States has both the opportunity and the responsibility to lead, not by dictating outcomes, but by fostering dialogue, building coalitions, and helping shape a world order that reflects a balance of interests and values. This will require humility, wisdom, and a deep understanding of the diverse traditions that coexist on the global stage. In the Islamic world and Asia, as elsewhere, order must be cultivated through a delicate blend of strength, empathy, and vision. This part of the book challenges the reader to look beyond familiar paradigms and consider how vastly different worldviews interact in a shrinking, interdependent world. Kissinger's analysis underscores the importance of historical memory, cultural context, and philosophical foundations in shaping global order. The multiplicity of Asian and Islamic perspectives is not a threat to be suppressed, but a reality to be engaged. If the 21st century is to avoid descending into chaos, it must find ways to harmonize these pluralistic orders into a system that promotes peace, justice, and mutual respect, without erasing the uniqueness of each civilization. Part 3. The United States and the World Order. The United States and Iran. Approaches to order. Note: same title as Chapter 4, but different content. The United States and the Future of World Order. In Part 3 of World Order, Henry Kissinger turns his attention to the role of the United States in shaping and sustaining international order, offering a deeply reflective and historically grounded analysis of American foreign policy. He brings into focus the United States' unique identity as a nation born of a revolutionary idea rather than a traditional state system, and he contrasts this with the worldviews of other civilizations, notably Iran, to illuminate the challenge of building a shared concept of world order. His analysis in this section does not merely trace American foreign relations in a historical sequence, but unpacks the ideological roots that inform America's perception of its global mission and how that mission interfaces, sometimes productively, often tensely, with other regional traditions and worldviews. In revisiting the subject of Iran, this time within the broader framework of U.S. foreign policy, Kissinger explores how the divergent political and spiritual traditions of the two nations set them on a path of almost structural opposition. Where the United States is a republic founded on Enlightenment ideals, liberty, democracy, and the rule of law, Iran is a theocratic state built upon a vision of divine authority and revolutionary struggle. Kissinger traces Iran's modern ideological foundation to the Islamic Revolution of 1979, which introduced a radical form of political shurism rooted in the concept of vilayat-e-faqih, or rule by the Islamic jurist. This notion upended centuries of Iranian dynastic rule and replaced it with a clerical system that sees its legitimacy as divinely ordained, not democratically elected. As such, Iran views its role not merely as a sovereign state in the Westphalian sense, but as a vanguard of global Islamic revolution, actively opposing what it sees as unjust world orders, chief among them, the American-led liberal international system. This ideological rift has fueled persistent mistrust and confrontation between the two nations. The U.S. views Iran's revolutionary ambitions as destabilizing, not only in the Middle East but globally, given Iran's support for non-state actors and its efforts to export its ideological model. In contrast, Iran views the U.S. as an imperial power trying to impose a secular and often hypocritical order on a world in need of moral correction. Kissinger underscores that this is not merely a political disagreement, but a metaphysical clash. While the U.S. tends to see international order as a set of rules and institutions facilitating cooperation and peace, Iran interprets order through a spiritual and eschatological lens, one that anticipates conflict as a vehicle for divine justice. The American tendency toward compromise and negotiation appears, from the Iranian perspective, as moral weakness or even heresy. This divergence renders diplomacy exceedingly difficult. Each side enters negotiations not only with conflicting interests, but with fundamentally incompatible worldviews. Kissinger does not treat the U.S. as a neutral or disinterested actor in this dynamic. He recognizes that America's own foreign policy history has often oscillated between moral absolutism and realpolitik, and this tension within American strategic thought has complicated its ability to engage consistently on the world stage. On one hand, the U.S. champions democracy and human rights. On the other, It has made pragmatic alliances with authoritarian regimes when it suited its interests. Kissinger argues that this duality has often confused both allies and adversaries, leading to perceptions of inconsistency or hypocrisy. But more fundamentally, it speaks to a deeper tension in the American identity, the struggle between the nation's self-perception as a moral beacon and its role as a geopolitical power. The United States, Kissinger observes, was born in a moment of moral conviction, a revolution not just against British rule, but against the entire European system of monarchy, hierarchy, and inherited privilege. Its founding documents proclaim universal values, and its national mythology revolves around the idea of a chosen people with a mission to promote freedom and democracy. This gives rise to what Kissinger terms missionary exceptionalism, the belief that America's values are not only universally valid but ought to be the basis of international order. This worldview is deeply embedded in American political culture and has led the U.S. to view international politics as a battle between right and wrong, rather than a competition among interests. As a result, when America engages with the world, it often does so with the expectation that other nations will, or should, eventually come to share its values. This moral conviction, however, sits uneasily alongside the requirements of international diplomacy, which often demand compromise, recognition of difference, and accommodation of competing traditions. Kissinger notes that American foreign policy has historically swung between two poles, the idealist and the realist. The idealist seeks to transform the world in America's image, promoting democracy, open markets, and human rights. The realist, by contrast, prioritizes stability, balance of power, and the national interest. These competing impulses have played out across various administrations. Wilsonian idealism after World War I clashed with the strategic pragmatism of Roosevelt during World War II and the Cold War balance pursued by Nixon and Kissinger himself. Post-Cold War triumphalism saw a resurgence of idealism, particularly under the banner of liberal interventionism in the 1990s and early 2000s. Kissinger is critical of the notion that the world can be remade in the American image through force or pressure. He argues that sustainable world order must rest on a foundation of legitimacy, that is, a broadly accepted set of principles that reflect the values and realities of diverse civilizations. No single model, not even the American one, can command universal assent if imposed unilaterally. He warns that America's tendency to conflate its values with universal truths can alienate other societies, especially those with strong historical and cultural identities, such as China, Russia, and Iran. For world order to be stable, it must reflect pluralism, not uniformity. This does not mean abandoning values, but recognizing that order arises from negotiation among differing visions, not the dominance of one. In his reflection on the future of world order, Kissinger turns to the great challenges facing international society in the 21st century. He highlights the erosion of the Westphalian system, which for centuries provided a basis for international relations based on sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference. Today, that system is under strain from multiple directions. Transnational threats, such as terrorism, cyberwarfare, pandemics, and climate change, ignore borders and require collective action, often beyond the capacity of existing institutions. At the same time, the rise of new powers, particularly China, and the resurgence of others, such as Russia, are challenging the dominance of Western institutions and norms. These emerging powers do not necessarily reject the idea of order, but offer alternative models rooted in their own histories and experiences. Kissinger contends that the United States will continue to play a central role in shaping the global order, but that role must evolve. Rather than insisting on universalizing its own system, America should position itself as a convener of consensus, capable of bridging civilizational divides and fostering dialogue among differing traditions. This will require a deeper understanding of non-Western worldviews and a greater humility about the limits of power. Leadership in this context means setting examples, not issuing ultimatums. It means building institutions that reflect global diversity, not just American preferences. The future of world order, Kissinger suggests, hinges on the ability of major powers to engage in a sustained dialogue about rules, norms, and responsibilities. The challenge is not merely technical but philosophical. How to construct a global system that allows for peaceful coexistence among fundamentally different conceptions of life, governance, and justice. The United States, with its tradition of pluralism and its capacity for self-renewal, is uniquely positioned to lead this effort, if it can reconcile its domestic ideals with the complexities of global politics. Kissinger concludes with a caution. The erosion of order does not necessarily lead to a new and better system. It may result in chaos and conflict. History is replete with examples of collapses that did not give rise to renewal, but to prolonged violence and uncertainty. In a world of nuclear weapons, instant communication, and tightly interconnected economies, the cost of disorder is exponentially higher than in previous eras. The imperative, therefore, is not to retreat into isolation or to press for unilateral solutions, but to forge a framework of coexistence that reflects the diversity and interdependence of the modern world that in essence. Kissinger's vision of world order is neither utopian nor cynical. It is grounded in historical experience and informed by a realist understanding of power, but it also acknowledges the role of values and ideals. He urges the United States to move beyond the binary of domination versus disengagement and to embrace a leadership role that is inclusive, pragmatic, and rooted in a deep awareness of history. Only through such a balanced approach can the promise of international order be preserved in an age of profound transformation. This section of the book is both a tribute to the American tradition and a sober critique of its limitations. Kissinger does not suggest abandoning the ideals that define the United States. Rather, he proposes situating them within a broader, more nuanced framework that respects other cultures and traditions. He invites American policymakers to see the world not as a canvas for their ideals, but as a mosaic of civilizations, each contributing a piece to the shared puzzle of order. In this way, the United States can remain a central architect of the international system, not as a hegemon, but as a steward of pluralism and stability in an ever-changing world that in conclusion Henry Kissinger brings together the threads of history, diplomacy, and global transformation to assess the complex challenges and opportunities shaping the international order in the 21st century. He does not merely reflect on what has come before, but rather turns his gaze forward, attempting to outline the essential conditions for a stable and peaceful world order in a time of profound change. His tone is both realistic and cautious, acknowledging the achievements of past orders while warning against complacency in the face of new and unpredictable forces. Kissinger argues that world order has always been a fragile construction, often built on the edge of chaos and preserved through careful diplomacy, shared values, and mutual recognition of legitimacy. In previous centuries, different civilizations and regions operated based on their own internal concepts of order. Europe with its balance of power system after the Peace of Westphalia, the Islamic world with its religiously inspired caliphates, China with its centralized empire and tributary systems, and the United States with its moralistic belief in universal democratic values. For a long time, these systems operated in isolation. But now, in the age of globalization, technology, and instant communication, these divergent traditions are colliding within a single global system. This is the central dilemma of the 21st century. How can a coherent world order be achieved when there is no longer any clear consensus on what that order should be? Kissinger stresses that a stable international system requires more than just military might or economic dominance. It demands a shared understanding of legitimacy, an agreement on the basic rules of conduct, acceptable behavior among nations, and principles of sovereignty and responsibility. Without this consensus, order cannot be sustained. The problem today, as he sees it, is that this consensus is eroding. Traditional powers like the United States and Europe are questioning their own roles and values, while rising powers such as China, Russia, and regional players like Iran are asserting alternative visions of order, often shaped by their own historical experiences and strategic priorities. One of Kissinger's key concerns is the uncertainty surrounding American foreign policy and the United States' long-term commitment to global leadership. For much of the 20th century, the U.S. was the principal architect and guardian of a liberal world order, promoting free markets, democracy, and collective security through institutions like the United Nations and NATO. But in recent years, domestic divisions, foreign policy fatigue, and rising populism have weakened the U.S.'s ability and willingness to lead. Kissinger warns that if America retreats from its global responsibilities without creating a sustainable alternative, the vacuum it leaves will likely be filled by disorder rather than peace. At the same time, he does not advocate a return to imperial dominance or ideological crusades. Instead, he calls for a renewed commitment to diplomacy, what he terms a patient search for an international system that reflects the multiplicity of values and interests in the modern world. Diplomacy, in his view, is not merely the art of negotiation, but a means of building a durable framework in which diverse states and cultures can coexist without constant conflict. This demands an understanding of history, geography, psychology, and cultural difference, qualities that Kissinger feels are often lacking in modern policymaking. In his analysis of other major players, Kissinger reflects on China's reemergence as a global power. He notes that China's historical preference for internal stability and centralized authority continues to shape its foreign policy. Rather than exporting ideology, China seeks recognition of its status and deference to its core interests, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. This does not necessarily mean it is bent on conquest, but it does suggest a different vision of order, one that emphasizes hierarchy, deference, and historical continuity. Kissinger suggests that the West must engage China not as an adversary to be contained, but as a civilization to be understood and integrated into the evolving global framework. He also considers Russia, which sees itself as a great power unfairly diminished after the Cold War and driven by a historical sense of insecurity. Russia's actions, particularly in its near abroad, are often aimed at restoring strategic depth and preventing perceived Western encroachment. Kissinger warns against interpreting every move by Russia through a Cold War lens, while also emphasizing the need for firm boundaries and mutual respect to avoid spirals of confrontation. Technology and its impact on world order also weigh heavily in this chapter. Kissinger is deeply concerned that advances in cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology are outpacing the ability of governments and institutions to regulate or understand their consequences. The potential for miscalculation, rapid escalation, or loss of control is immense. Unlike nuclear weapons, which required massive infrastructure and were tightly regulated during the Cold War, cyber tools are cheap, accessible, and deniable. This creates new vulnerabilities and undermines the traditional mechanisms of deterrence. He warns that if these domains are not brought under a shared international framework, they could become catalysts for disorder on a global scale. The Middle East, too, occupies Kissinger's attention. He argues that the region has largely collapsed into a struggle between state authority and ideological extremism, exacerbated by the failure of borders and political institutions to adapt to modern governance. The Arab Spring, which many hoped would usher in democracy, instead unleashed long-standing tensions and created power vacuums exploited by terrorists and sectarian groups. Kissinger sees no easy solution here, but emphasizes the need for a concerted international effort to rebuild institutions, strengthen legitimate governments, and foster a political equilibrium that balances religious and national identities. Finally, Kissinger returns to the concept of world order itself, not as a rigid system, but as a constantly evolving balance of power, legitimacy, and shared purpose. He acknowledges that perfect harmony among nations is unattainable. However, he insists that the alternative, chaos, conflict, and mutual suspicion, is far worse. The challenge, then, is to construct an order that is inclusive, flexible, and rooted in a realistic understanding of human nature and national interest. The conclusion is not prescriptive in the traditional sense. It does not offer a blueprint or list of reforms. Instead, it is a deeply philosophical reflection on what it means to live in a connected world with clashing histories and identities. Kissinger's message is clear: world order will not emerge by accident. It must be built deliberately, maintained vigilantly, and adapted wisely. The fate of the 21st century depends on whether statesmen can rise to this task with the necessary vision, patience, and courage.